Okay, so just for completeness, we will follow the book and include a tiny bit of introduction to climate change economics. When you say economics, you are usually thinking about supply, demand, cost, return on investments, and so on. So things that have value, market value, tend to be included in the economics, and earth system, climate, common goods like the atmosphere, ocean, land are all often non-market goods, so it's always a challenge as to how one would put value on them, or how one would find a way to pay for protecting them for future generations, right? People are very aware on how to plan for the future of their kids even before the kids are born, college funds, etc. But how to save the environment for the kids is not always so obvious. Plus the insurance model, where you buy insurance for protecting yourself against accidents, house fires, floods, etc., or crop insurance, somehow doesn't extend to buying insurance for the environment or for climate, because in general there are issues of shared goods, common goods, and you heard of the tragedy of the commons, I'm sure, where the idea comes from the 1960s from Holden and Ehrlich. Idea is, if you think of a pasture that's shared by a bunch of cattle herders, let's say, the pasture is free to graze your cows. You have to pay for the cows and get them, and if there are a number of people sharing the pasture, then nobody has the incentive to save the pasture, and the idea is that people will keep buying more and more cattle to increase their income and graze it freely, and eventually there is not enough grass, fodder for anybody. So this is typically the example of the tragedy of the commons. So if you're polluting the atmosphere and you pollute here, it affects everybody, like CO2, then everybody keeps emitting because nobody is responsible for the global atmosphere. Then we end up with tragedy of the commons, which global warming is kind of a tragedy of the commons, right? But there are ideas of ecosystem services that have been around for a while. People even try to put monetary values on them, and here is a figure from ecology, fnal.gov, which says the services provided by nature, ecosystem services, what nature provides us for free. So supporting, provisioning, regulating, and cultural. So obviously there are things like biodiversity, photosynthesis, soil formation, food, clean water, fish, wood, pollination, cool temperatures, control flooding, purify water, store carbon, clean air, education, recreation, aesthetics, stewardship, habitat. Sounds fantastic. Nobody will disagree with this, but how would you pay for something like biodiversity? If there is a tree standing there, everybody would love to have a forest or a tree, but who would pay for it? What is the value of this tree? How do you value it? It's a non-market good. If you cut it and make furniture, obviously you can see how much it's worth, but what is the value when it's just standing there and giving you shade and cool temperatures, and so on? So those are always difficult issues, but there is now more and more awareness that there are social and economic impacts of climate change. So there are situations where entire towns are either going underwater or becoming too dry and too hot to live. Productivity of crop yields is decreasing. Basic foodstuff and consumer goods are already affected seriously by climate change, like the Arab Spring, and the food prices following the extended droughts in the Middle East is something we mentioned before. Extreme meteorological phenomenon will cause widespread poverty, so there is several $billion worth of damage every year due to rainfall extremes over India, for example. Diseases will spread due to higher temperatures. Already there is, we talked a little bit about it before, heat waves, extreme rain, floods, droughts, already they are beginning to have enormous impact on nations' economies and individual livelihoods. Fresh water will be in short supply in some areas. This is already playing out in western US, between countries, in neighborhoods where water is very scarce. More wars to gain access to limited resources. There are already many studies showing that several civil and armed conflicts are related to climate change impacts. And as I said before, climate is not always the proximal cause or the immediate cause of conflicts, but when there are already lots of stresses between, let's say, distrust between two neighbors, for whatever reason, then resource limitations caused by climate change, climate impact, can tip things over and lead to conflicts or elevated risk of conflict. Loss of capacity to work due to heat. This is already well documented. Many good papers appear in the Lancet and other journals where heat wave related productivity losses are well documented. There is even an optimum temperature at which humans are most productive, or even cattle and crop yields are most optimum at certain temperatures. When temperatures go above that, you have issues. Cost of adapting coastal areas to rising sea levels. This is also playing out in many places where rising sea level, increasing strength of the cyclones, rapid intensification, slower moving cyclones dumping more rain, and so on, are beginning to affect property values, general tourism, and so on in coastal areas. But the continued increases in coastal populations are expected to go on for some time, and this adaptation is a big challenge there. This is from Deloitte Insights, stylized links between climate and the economy. So I'm making some general points leading up to some specific points we will look at very briefly. Climate change direct effects include chronic and acute physical effects, physical impacts, indirect effects, so transition and liability impact, change in policies, change in technology, change in preferences. So people, for example, after COVID apparently are abandoning cities and moving to urban areas. That's going to create pressure on resources, infrastructure, and different sorts of driving habits and so on and so forth, and associated environmental impacts and climate shifts as well. Economic shifts as well. Economic effects of climate change, direct and indirect effect at micro and macro levels, and financial instabilities will occur or already occurring through business disruptions, supply chain, critical infrastructure. For example, when there was Typhoon Haiyan over the Philippines in 2011, the cascade of things that are exported by Philippines to the rest of the world were computed, and many countries far away had direct and indirect impacts on their GDPs because Philippines was out of business, out of the supply chain for some time. Property damage, health impacts, stranded assets, places may become unlivable, legal liabilities, changing demand patterns, changing costs, so carbon price, we will come back to that, and new capital expenditures. These are at the micro level. At the macro level, you will have capital depreciation, shifts in prices, changes in investment patterns, productivity changes due to health effects, we already mentioned that, productivity changes due to investment diversion. So if a place becomes, let's say, directly unproductive because of excess warming or excess rain events, flooding, droughts, whatever, you're going to have investments going elsewhere. Labor market frictions are going to be common. Societal frictions, so migration and conflict, this is already playing out in many places. Syria being one example. Rohingyas and their migration and displacement, climate change related migrations within the country across borders are now quite well documented. Impact on international trade, as I mentioned, example Typhoon Haiyan, but also many other examples of places getting hammered and getting putting pressure on markets. Impacts on government revenue. Obviously, every year climate catastrophes, weather events are causing billions and billions of dollars in direct losses and also in economic losses. Financial stability, credit risks, defaults, collateral depreciation, underwriting risks, insurance losses, insurance gap. This is becoming more and more noticed. So reinsurance companies like Munich Re and Swiss Re are working hard on protecting themselves against climate issues, climate change impacts. Market risks, so repricing of assets, and liquidity risks. Okay, so climate change, we used to think of it as threatening our existence, but now more and more ideas are beginning to see how climate change threatens our economy. Just like the carbon trap we talked about, reducing emissions versus changing the system to decarbonize ourselves, dealing with climate change as something that affects life versus something that is going to fundamentally change life and economy are going to lead to different kinds of agreements, actions, policies, investments, regulations, and so on and so forth. Okay, this is another way to think about it. If we think about the economics of climate change, there has to be a roadmap, and this provides one example introducing the economics of climate change. As you know, Bill Nordhaus, who wrote The Climate Casino, won a Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for economics. The future costs of climate change, most important number you've never heard of, the social cost of carbon. I will come back to that. Carbon pricing, we will talk a bit about that. Costing what's priceless or non-market goods like biodiversity, ecosystems, life, health, economists and the future of humanity. What economists actually think about the insurance industry. How can we develop an insurance model for climate? Already it's playing out in terms of people wanting to live in hurricane prone areas, sea level rise areas, Miami for example. Why we can't underestimate our potential to innovate. Climate solutions, green technology, carbon capture, sequestration, etc., electric vehicles, what we can actually do about climate change, and what I can do as an individual. This is much more difficult, especially there are many issues of people not having the ability to track their impact at every step of the way, in what they eat, what they consume, what they drive, how much they travel, etc. Plus the system itself not being very amenable right now for individuals to actually do too much. Okay, so let's leave it here and come back and add a few more points on climate economics. Okay.